A grizzled Dakota hunter found a dying Apache girl hidden in his wagon shed on the coldest night of 1847, her body broken and her spirit nearly shattered by unspeakable cruelty. What he chose to do in those next crucial hours would not only save her life but spark a chain of events so extraordinary that frontier storytellers would speak of it in hushed, reverent tones for generations to come.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
This is the true story of how an act of unexpected mercy between two sworn enemies became the most legendary tale of the Dakota Territory. The wind that November night carried more than just the bite of approaching winter. It carried the scent of violence, the metallic tang of spilled blood, and the acrid smoke of burnt dreams. Wade Cordell had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 days through the jagged terrain of what the locals called Broken Lance Ridge, named for the shattered remains of Lakota war spears that still jutted from the rocky outcropping like ancient grave markers. The beast had taken 2 of his best arrows and still managed to disappear into the maze of pine and granite that dominated this particular stretch of the Dakota Territory. Wade was not a man given to superstition, but even he felt the weight of this place pressing down on his shoulders like a burial shroud. The ridge had seen more than its share of blood over the years, first between the Lakota and the Apache, then between the settlers in both tribes, and now between the U.S. Army and anyone who dared to call this land home. At 41, Wade had lived through enough frontier violence to recognize when a place held too many ghosts, and Broken Lance Ridge fairly writhed with them. His cabin sat in a small clearing about 2 miles from the main settlement of Crows Hollow, a ramshackle collection of buildings that optimistically called itself a town, despite housing fewer than 200 souls. Wade had chosen the isolation deliberately after losing his wife Catherine and their young daughter Emma to a Comanche raid 4 winters prior. He had returned from a hunting trip to find his home burned, his family butchered, and his entire world reduced to ash and blood-soaked earth. The rage had nearly consumed him then, driving him to spend 2 years hunting the war party responsible with a fury that bordered on madness. When he finally caught up with them, the violence he unleashed was so brutal that even hardened frontiersmen spoke of it in whispers. But revenge had brought him no peace, only a hollow emptiness that echoed louder than any scream. So Wade had walked away from the settlements, from the company of other men, from everything that reminded him of the life he had lost. He built his cabin in the shadow of Broken Lance Ridge, not because the location was particularly advantageous, but because the loneliness of the place matched the desolation in his soul. The cabin he had constructed was solid and practical, built from thick pine logs chinked with mud and moss. It wasn't much to look at, but it kept the wind out and the warmth in, which was all a man needed to survive in this unforgiving country. Behind the main structure stood a smaller building, part workshop, part storage shed, part sanctuary for the times when even his own company became too much to bear. He kept his wagon there during the harsh months, along with his tools, his extra supplies, and the few possessions that still held meaning for him. Wade had been away from the cabin for 5 days on this particular hunting expedition, following game trails that led deeper into the wilderness than he usually ventured. The elk he pursued was a magnificent specimen, easily the largest he had ever tracked, with antlers that would have made any hunter's heart race with anticipation. But the animal was also clever, leading him through terrain that seemed designed to test both his skill and his determination. The snow had started falling on the second day, not the gentle, lazy flakes of early winter, but the hard, driving pellets that warned of a serious storm to come. By the 4th day, Wade was pushing through drifts that reached his knees, his breath forming clouds of vapor that froze before they could dissipate. His horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Ranger, had begun to show signs of exhaustion. his usually sure footing becoming uncertain on the increasingly treacherous ground. It was on the fifth day that Wade finally admitted defeat. The Elk's trail had disappeared entirely beneath the accumulating snow, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Worse, the temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, and Wade knew that being caught in the open during a Dakota blizzard was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. The journey back to his cabin took longer than expected. What should have been a 2-hour ride stretched into 4 as Wade was forced to navigate around fallen trees and snowdrifts that had transformed familiar landmarks into alien landscapes. By the time he spotted the dark silhouette of his cabin through the swirling snow, full darkness had fallen, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves through the pine boughs overhead. Wade had left no fire burning in the hearth before departing. He was too experienced a frontiersman to risk an unattended flame, even banked properly. The cabin stood cold and dark against the storm, its windows like dead eyes staring out at the wilderness. But it was still home, still the refuge he had built with his own hands in the middle of nowhere, and the sight of it filled him with a relief so profound that he actually felt his shoulders relax for the first time in days. He led Ranger to the small lean-to shelter he had built adjacent to the cabin, brushing the snow from the horse's coat and ensuring he had enough hay and water to last through the night. The gelding snorted and stamped his hooves, clearly as eager as Wade to be out of the bitter wind. Wade had always been good with animals. They seemed to sense something in him that put them at ease, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to survive in a hostile world. After securing Ranger, Wade shouldered his pack and rifle and trudged through the deepening snow toward his front door. The wind had picked up even more in the few minutes he had been outside, and he could feel ice crystals forming in his beard, despite the woolen scarf wrapped around his face. His fingers, even protected by thick leather gloves, were beginning to lose feeling, and he knew he needed to get inside and start a fire before the real cold set in. But as he approached the cabin, something made him pause. Call it instinct, call it the paranoia that kept men alive in the territories, but Wade had learned long ago to trust the feeling when something wasn't quite right. He stood perfectly still in the swirling snow, listening intently despite the howling of the wind. There was a sound that didn't belong. Not the creak of settling wood or the rattle of loose shutters, but something else. Something that sounded almost like ... a whimper. Faint, barely audible above the storm, but definitely there. Wade's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver on his hip as he scanned the darkness around his cabin. Indians didn't usually attack during blizzards, but desperate men did desperate things, and there were plenty of both red and white outlaws who might see a isolated cabin as an easy target. He had dealt with such problems before, and his reputation in the territory was fearsome enough that most troublemakers gave his property a wide berth. But the sound came again, and this time Wade was able to locate its source. It was coming from behind the cabin, from the direction of his wagon shed, moving with the silent grace that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Wade made his way around the side of the cabin, his rifle ready in his hands. The snow crunched softly under his boots despite his efforts to move quietly, but the wind was loud enough to cover most sounds. As he approached the shed, he could see that the door was slightly ajar, something that made his blood run cold. He always secured that door with a heavy wooden bar, and it would take considerable force or considerable skill to open it, without leaving obvious signs of damage. Wade pressed himself against the wall of the shed and listened intently. The whimpering sound was definitely coming from inside, accompanied now by what sounded like ragged, labored breathing. Whoever was in there was hurt, possibly dying, but that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Wounded animals were often the most vicious, and wounded men could be even worse. Taking a deep breath, Wade kicked the door open and stepped inside with his rifle raised, ready to fire at the first sign of threat.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
What he saw in the dim interior of the shed made him freeze in complete shock. Huddled in the far corner, half buried beneath a pile of old horse blankets, was a young woman. But this wasn't some lost settler or cavalry wife, the dark copper. Of her skin, the intricate beadwork on her torn clothing, and the distinctive style of her braided hair marked her unmistakably as Apache. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid, and even in the poor light Wade could see the dark stains of blood on the blankets around her. For a moment, Wade simply stared in disbelief. An Apache girl, alone and injured, hiding in his wagon shed in the middle of a blizzard. It defied all logic and experience. Apache women didn't travel alone, especially not in winter, and they certainly didn't seek shelter in the homes of white settlers. The two peoples had been at war for as long as anyone could remember, each viewing the other as an enemy to be killed on sight. But as Wade looked more closely, his shock began to give way to something else. The girl couldn't be more than 17 or 18 years old, with delicate features that would have been beautiful if not marred by pain and exhaustion. Her clothes were not just torn but shredded, as if she had been dragged through thorny brush for miles. Dark bruises covered her visible skin, and Wade's experienced eye could see the telltale signs of rope burns on her wrists and ankles. This wasn't a warrior caught in battle or a raider taken prisoner. This was someone who had been brutalized, tortured, and left to die. And somehow, against all odds, she had made it to his shed. The girl's eyes fluttered open as Wade stepped closer, and for a moment their gazes met across the small space. Her eyes were dark as midnight, filled with pain and fear, but also with a fierce intelligence that spoke of an unbroken spirit, despite whatever horrors she had endured. She tried to move, perhaps to flee or to defend herself, but the effort only caused her to cry out in pain and collapse back onto the blankets. Wade found himself in a position he had never imagined. Here was a member of the people who had murdered his family, who had destroyed his life and driven him to this lonely existence. By all the laws of the frontier, by every code of vengeance and survival that governed life in the territories, he should put a bullet in her head and be done with it. No one would question such an action, and many would praise it. But as he looked down at the broken girl huddled in his shed, Wade felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 4 long years. Compassion. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, not with the hatred he would have expected, but with a desperate hope that suggested she knew he held her life in his hands. Perhaps it was simply that she reminded him of his own daughter, who would be about this girl's age if she had lived. Or perhaps it was the realization that whatever had been done to this young woman was so terrible that even an Apache had chosen to trust her life to a white settler rather than face it again. Wade lowered his rifle and took another step closer. The girl flinched but didn't try to move away. She probably couldn't even if she wanted to. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and Wade could see that she was losing the battle against whatever injuries she had sustained. If he was going to make a decision, it had to be now. "Easy there, girl," he said softly, his voice rusty from days of disuse. "I ain't going to hurt you." She probably couldn't understand his words, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. Her eyes remained fixed on his face as he knelt down beside her, and Wade was struck by the trust he saw there. It was irrational and impossible, but this Apache girl was placing her life in the hands of a man who should have been her mortal enemy. Wade gently pulled back the blankets to assess her injuries, and what he saw made his jaw clench with anger. The girl had been shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the side, though both wounds appeared to be several days old and showed signs of crude field treatment. But the bullet wounds were not the worst of her injuries. Her body bore the marks of systematic torture, burns, cuts, bruises in patterns that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than the random violence of battle. Someone had hurt this girl for The pleasure of hurting her had tortured her with the methodical thoroughness of a man who enjoyed his work. The rage that Wade had thought buried began to stir in his chest, but he pushed it down. There would be time for anger later. Right now, this young woman needed help, and she needed it immediately. Wade had learned basic field medicine during his years in the territorial militia, and he had treated enough gunshot wounds to know what needed to be done. The girl was suffering from blood loss, exposure, and what appeared to be a raging fever. Without immediate care, she would be dead by morning. He could still walk away. Could close the door, go into his cabin, light his fire, and pretend he had never seen her. By morning, the problem would solve itself, and he could bury the body when the weather cleared. It would be easier, safer, and more in keeping with the brutal realities of frontier life. But Wade had spent 4 years living with the consequences of violence, had seen what hatred and vengeance could do to a man's soul. He had lost his humanity. Once in pursuit of revenge, had become something darker and more terrible than the men who had killed his family. It had taken him years to claw his way back to something resembling human decency, and he wasn't willing to throw that away now. Decision made, Wade scooped the girl up in his arms, blankets and all. She was so light that he was reminded again of how young she was, how fragile despite the warrior blood that ran in her veins. She murmured something in her native tongue as he lifted her, words that sounded like a prayer or perhaps a goodbye. "Not tonight," Wade said grimly as he carried her toward his cabin. "Death can wait till morning." The wind howled around them. As Wade kicked open his front door and stepped into the cold darkness of his home, behind them, the wagon shed stood empty, its secrets revealed and its burden lifted. But ahead lay a night that would test everything Wade thought he knew about himself, about his enemies, and about the thin line between civilization and savagery that defined life on the frontier. As he laid the unconscious girl on his bed and began stoking the fire that would keep them both alive through the brutal night ahead, Wade Cordell had no idea that his simple act of mercy was about to set in motion a series of events that would echo through the Dakota territory for generations to come. All he knew was that for the first time in 4 years, he was no longer alone. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was just beginning. The first thing Wade noticed as he lit the oil lamp was the intricate scarification on the girl's left shoulder, not the crude marks of torture, but the deliberate artistry of Apache coming-of-age ceremonies. The patterns told a story he couldn't read, but their very presence confirmed what he had suspected. This wasn't just any Apache girl. The quality of the beadwork on her torn clothing, the silver bracelets still clinging to her wrists despite her ordeal, and the elaborate nature of her ceremonial scars all pointed to someone of significant standing within her tribe. Wade had seen enough Apache prisoners during his militia days to recognize the markings of a chief's daughter or a medicine woman's apprentice, which made her presence in his shed even more puzzling and infinitely more dangerous. If this girl was important to her people, her disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed. War parties would be searching for her, and when they found her trail leading to a white settler's cabin, they wouldn't be interested in explanations, but those concerns would have to wait. Right now, the girl was dying, and Wade's immediate focus had to be on keeping her alive through the night. He had treated enough battlefield wounds to know the signs of impending death, the grayish pallor of her skin, the rapid, shallow breathing, the way her body had begun to shut down non-essential functions to preserve what little strength remained. The bullet wounds were infected. That much was clear from the angry red streaks radiating outward from the entry points. The crude field dressing someone had applied strips of cloth that looked like they had been torn from a cavalry uniform had probably saved her life initially by slowing the bleeding. But now the makeshift bandages were doing more harm than good, trapping infection and preventing proper drainage. Wade heated water in his largest pot while laying out the supplies he would need. clean cloth torn from one of his spare shirts, a bottle of whiskey for sterilization, needle and thread for suturing, and a sharp knife heated in the fire to cauterize any bleeding vessels he couldn't tie off. He had performed this same ritual too many times during his years of violence, but never under circumstances quite like these. As he worked to clean and dress the girl's wounds, Wade found himself studying her face in the lamplight. Even unconscious and ravaged by fever, she possessed a striking beauty that spoke of proud bloodlines and fierce independence. Her features were delicate but strong, with the high cheekbones and aquiline nose that marked her as pure Apache rather than mixed blood. Her hands, when he examined them for additional injuries, showed the calluses of someone skilled in traditional crafts beadwork, hide preparation, perhaps even weapon making. The girl stirred as Wade cleaned the bullet wound in her shoulder, her eyes fluttering open to focus on his face with surprising clarity. She said something in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an unmistakable tone of command. When Wade didn't respond, she switched to broken Spanish, then to English that was heavily accented, but perfectly understandable. "You. Why do you help me?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his face for answers. "I am. I am your enemy." Wade paused in his work, struck by the directness of her question. "Maybe," he said after a moment. "But right now, you're just a hurt girl who needs help." She studied him for a long moment, and Wade had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing more than just his face, that she was somehow reading the scars on his soul as clearly as he could read the wounds on her body. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with something that might have been understanding. "You have lost much," she said. It wasn't a question. Wade's hand stilled on the bandage he was wrapping. "What makes you say that?" "Your eyes," she replied simply. "They carry the same darkness that mine do, the darkness of watching everything you love die." The observation hit Wade like a physical blow. He had thought he had buried his grief so deeply that it wouldn't show. But this Apache girl had seen through his carefully constructed walls in a matter of moments. Perhaps it took someone who had experienced similar loss to recognize the signs. "What's your name?" Wade asked, deflecting the conversation away from his own pain. The girl hesitated, and Wade could see her weighing the wisdom of revealing her identity. Finally, she spoke a word in Apache that sounded like flowing water over stones. When Wade looked confused, she tried again. "In your tongue it means morning star, but my people call me Ayanna." Wade nodded, filing the name away. "I'm Wade. Wade Cordell." "What Ayanna repeated, her pronunciation turning his name into something almost musical. "You are known to my people, the one who hunts the hunters, the ghost who walks in vengeance." Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. His reputation among the Apache was apparently more extensive than he had realized. The 2 years he had spent tracking down his family's killers had taken him deep into Apache territory, and he had left a trail of bodies in his wake. If Ayanna knew who he was, she had to know how dangerous it was for her to be here. "If you know who I am," Wade said carefully, "then you know why this is a bad idea for both of us." Ayanna's eyes never left his face. "I know who you were," she said, "but I also know who you are now. If you were still the ghost, I would already be dead." The simple truth of her words settled between them like a bridge spanning a chasm of mutual understanding. Wade continued his work in silence, but something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. The tension was still there, but it was no longer the brittle hostility of natural enemies. Instead, it had become something more complex, a recognition of shared pain and mutual vulnerability. As Wade finished dressing Ayanna's wounds, she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper, telling him in fractured English and occasional Spanish how she had come to be in his shed. Her story unfolded in fragments, interrupted by bouts of fever and pain. But gradually Wade began to piece together a picture of horror, that made his own quest for vengeance seem almost civilized by comparison. Ayanna was indeed a chief's daughter, the youngest child of a war leader named Nalnish, who had been trying to negotiate a peace treaty with the U.S. Army. She had been traveling with a small delegation to a meeting at Fort Laramie when they had been attacked by a group of men wearing cavalry uniforms. But these weren't regular soldiers. They were deserters and outlaws led by a rogue sergeant named Caleb Morrison, who had been selling stolen army weapons to various Indian tribes and blaming the resulting violence on treaty violations. The delegation had been wiped out, but not before Ayanna's father had managed to wound Morrison and several of his men. Ayanna herself had been taken alive, not as a prisoner of war, but as a plaything for Morrison's men. For 3 days, she had been subjected to systematic torture and abuse while Morrison tried to extract information about Apache weapon caches and planned raids. He wanted to know things that only the war chiefs know, Ayanna whispered, her voice growing weaker as the fever took hold. Sacred places, hidden trails, the location of our winter camps. He said he would sell the information to the highest bidder. Wade felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but this time it wasn't the wild, consuming fury that had driven him for 2 years. This was something colder, more focused, the anger of a man who had seen too much injustice and finally found a cause worth fighting for. "How did you escape?" he asked. Ayanna's lips curved in what might have been a smile if it hadn't been so filled with pain. "Morrison's men grew careless. They thought I was too weak to fight back. But my grandmother taught me the old ways, how to dislocate joints, how to make bonds loose, how to move like smoke when the moment comes." She had slipped her bonds during the night, killed 2 guards with a knife she had stolen from their own belts, and disappeared into the wilderness. But she had been badly wounded in the escape, and without proper medical attention, infection had set in. For 2 days, she had been stumbling through the forest, following game trails and avoiding the search parties she knew would be hunting her. "I saw the smoke from your chimney," she said, her voice fading as exhaustion took hold. I thought if I could just rest for a few hours." "You did right," Wade said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Wade knew they weren't entirely true. Ayanna might be safe from Morrison and his men for the moment, but their problems were far from over. The storm outside was showing no signs of abating, and even if it cleared, traveling would be dangerous for someone in Ayanna's condition. And then there was the question of what to do when she recovered. If she recovered. As if reading his thoughts, Ayanna spoke again, her voice now barely audible. "My people will come looking for me when they find me here." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They both knew what would happen if a Apache war party found their chief's daughter in the cabin of a known Indian fighter. "We'll figure something out," Wade said, though he had no idea what that something might be. "Right now, you need to rest." Ayanna nodded, her eyes already closing as the fever and exhaustion finally claimed her. Wade watched her breathing for a few minutes, noting that it seemed slightly steadier than before. The immediate crisis had passed, but he knew the real challenges were just beginning. Wade spent the rest of the night tending to Ayanna's fever, cooling her burning skin with damp cloths, and forcing small amounts of willow bark tea between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. The storm continued to rage outside, piling snow against the windows and sending wind down the chimney to make the fire dance and flicker. But inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Wade found himself studying Ayanna's face in the lamplight, noticing details he had missed during the initial crisis. The way her eyebrows arched slightly when she dreamed, suggesting pleasant memories despite her recent ordeal. The small scar on her chin that spoke of childhood adventures and scraped knees. The intricate tattoo on her wrist that looked like a family symbol or clan marking. These were the details that made her human rather than just another Apache, another enemy to be fought or feared. Wade had spent so many years seeing her people as a faceless threat that he had forgotten they were individuals with their own stories, their own losses, their own capacity for both love and suffering. Around midnight, Ayanna woke suddenly, her eyes wide with terror as she relived some nightmare from her captivity. She cried out in Apache, her body rigid with remembered pain, and Wade found himself reaching out instinctively to comfort her. "It's all right," he said softly, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You're safe. It was just a dream." Ayanna's eyes focused on his face, and Wade saw the exact moment when she remembered where she was. The terror faded, replaced by something like wonder as she looked at him. "You stayed," she said, as if surprised by this simple act of care. "Where else would I go?" Wade replied. "It's my cabin." But they both knew his vigil had been about more than just protecting his property. Somehow, during the long night hours, Wade had rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever, the ability to care about another person's well-being. And Ayanna had found something equally precious, a reason to believe that not all white men were monsters. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to subside, though the snow continued to fall in lazy, fat flakes that would make travel impossible for at least another day. Wade dozed fitfully in his chair beside the bed, his rifle within easy reach but his hand resting protectively near Ayanna's shoulder. When he woke fully, the cabin was filled with the gray light of early morning, and Ayanna was watching him with eyes that held a clarity they had lacked the night before. Her fever had broken, and though she was still weak, Wade could see that she was going to survive. "Thank you," she said simply, and those two words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. Wade nodded, suddenly awkward in the face of her gratitude. "You would have done the same," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Would I?" Ayanna asked, her voice thoughtful. "If I had found you broken and bleeding in my father's lodge, would I have seen past the uniform and the reputation to the man beneath?" It was a question Wade couldn't answer, and perhaps that was the point. They were both discovering that their capacity for compassion was larger than their capacity for hatred, and that discovery was changing them in ways neither had expected. Outside, the storm was dying, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather was just beginning to clear. The long night had transformed two enemies into something approaching allies, and possibly something more. But as the morning light grew stronger, both Wade and Ayanna knew that their real test was yet to come. The world outside the cabin hadn't changed, even if they had. Morrison and his men were still hunting for Ayanna, and her people were still searching for their missing chief's daughter. The hatred and violence that had shaped both their lives was still waiting beyond the door, and soon they would have to face it together. But for now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, they allowed themselves to believe that perhaps some wounds could heal, some enemies could become friends, and some stories could have endings that no one saw coming. As the morning progressed, Wade prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried venison, softened with hot water to make it easier for Ayanna to swallow. She managed only a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed her again, but Wade was encouraged to see that she was keeping the food down. Her body was beginning the long process of recovery, though he knew it would be weeks before she was fully healed. While Ayanna slept, Wade took stock of his situation with the cold pragmatism that had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters. The storm had left nearly 3 feet of snow on the ground, making travel impossible for at least several days. Even when conditions improved, Ayanna would be in no shape for the grueling journey it would take to reach either friendly territory or her own people's lands. More troubling was the question of pursuit. Morrison and his renegades would be searching for Ayanna, and they would be desperate to find her before she could expose their crimes to the authorities. These weren't men bound by military discipline or rules of engagement. They were Outlaws with nothing to lose and everything to gain by silencing the only witness to their atrocities. Wade checked his weapons and ammunition, taking inventory of his defensive capabilities. He had his rifle, 2 revolvers, a shotgun, and enough ammunition for a prolonged fight if it came to that. The cabin itself was well built and defensible, with thick log walls that would stop most rifle rounds, and good fields of fire from the windows. If Morrison's men came calling, Wade would be ready for them. But even as he made these preparations, Wade found himself hoping that violence could be avoided. The rage that had sustained him for 2 years was still there, but it had been tempered by something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of responsibility for another person's well-being. Ayanna's presence had awakened protective instincts he thought had died with his family, and he discovered that he would do almost anything to keep her safe. The afternoon brought a brief respite from the snow, and Wade used the opportunity to check on Ranger and ensure his horse had adequate shelter and feed. As he worked in the lean-to, he noticed tracks in the snow that hadn't been there the night before, the paw prints of a large wolf, circling the cabin at a respectful distance, but clearly investigating the unusual scents and sounds. Wade wasn't particularly concerned about a single wolf, but the tracks reminded him that they weren't the only predators in these mountains. The storm would have driven game to lower elevations, and hungry carnivores might be emboldened to approach human habitation in search of easy prey. It was one more factor to consider in an already complex situation. When he returned to the cabin, Wade found Ayanna awake and sitting up in bed, though the effort clearly cost her considerable strength. She had managed to braid her long black hair into a single plait that hung over her shoulder, and someone less experienced might have mistaken the action for mere vanity. But Wade recognized it for what it was: a warrior's preparation, ensuring that her hair wouldn't obstruct her vision or provide an enemy with something to grab in close combat. "You're expecting trouble," Ayanna observed, nodding toward the weapons Wade had laid out on the table. "Always do," Wade replied. "It's kept me alive this long." Ayanna studied the arsenal with the appreciative eye of someone who understood weaponry. "Morrison's men are cowards," she said. "They prefer to attack in large numbers, usually at night. But they are not without skill. Several of them served in the war back east." Wade nodded grimly. He had encountered enough Confederate deserters and Union Army rejects to know that military training, combined with desperation and a lack of moral constraints, could create very dangerous adversaries indeed. "How many men does Morrison have?" Wade asked. "I counted 15 during my captivity," Ayanna replied. "Perhaps more at their main camp. They have good horses, modern weapons, and enough supplies to stay in the field for months." The numbers weren't encouraging, but Wade had faced worse odds during his years of vengeance-seeking. The difference was that now he had someone to protect, which both complicated his tactical options and gave him additional motivation to survive. "There's something else you should know," Ayanna continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Morrison spoke of having contacts within the territorial government, men who profit from the continued conflict between your people and mine. My father's peace mission threatened their business arrangements." Wade felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Corruption in territorial administrations was nothing new, but the scope of what Ayanna was describing suggested a conspiracy that reached far beyond a few rogue soldiers selling stolen weapons. If Morrison had political protection, it would explain how he had been able to operate with such impunity. "Who are these contacts?" Wade asked. Ayanna shook her head. "I heard only first names: Thomas, Charles, someone called the Colonel." Morrison was careful not to reveal too much, even to his own men. The information was frustratingly vague, but it confirmed Wade's growing suspicion that they were dealing with more than just a band of common outlaws. The stakes were higher than he had initially realized, and the danger correspondingly greater. As evening approached, Wade prepared another meal, and was gratified to see that Ayana's appetite was beginning to return. She managed to eat a full bowl of stew and even smiled when Wade told her a story about one of his more embarrassing hunting mishaps. The smile transformed her face completely, revealing the vibrant young woman she had been before Morrison's brutality had marked her. "You're different than I expected," Ayana said as they sat by the fire after dinner. "The stories my people tell about the ghost who hunts in vengeance. They speak of a creature without mercy, without human feeling." Wade stared into the flames, remembering the man he had been during those dark years. "Maybe I was," he said quietly. "Maybe I needed to be for a while, but not anymore." Wade looked at her, this young Apache woman who had somehow managed to see past his reputation to the man beneath. "No," he said, "not anymore." They talked long into the night, sharing stories of their childhood, their families, their hopes and dreams before violence had reshaped their lives. Wade learned that Ayana had been trained not just in traditional women's crafts, but also in the arts of war, that she could shoot a bow with deadly accuracy, and had once killed a mountain lion with nothing but a knife in her wits. Ayana, in turn, discovered that Wade had once been a teacher in a small Missouri town, that he had read extensively in literature and philosophy, and that his descent into violence had been as much a betrayal of his own nature as it had been a response to tragedy. As the fire burned low, and Ayana's eyelids grew heavy with exhaustion, Wade found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers they faced, he would not abandon this remarkable young woman to face them alone. She had awakened something in him that he had thought lost forever, not just compassion, but hope, the last thing Wade saw before sleep claimed him was Ayana's face in the dying firelight, peaceful at last after so much suffering. And for the first time in 4 years, Wade Cordell slept without nightmares, his rest protected by the presence of someone who had given him a reason to believe in tomorrow. The third morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight turning the fresh snow into a blinding carpet of diamonds that stretched as far as the eye could see. Wade stood at his cabin window, coffee mug in hand, studying the pristine wilderness that surrounded his home. The beauty of the scene was deceptive. Beneath that peaceful facade lay dangers that could destroy everything he had worked to build, everything he had found worth protecting. Ayana was stronger today, able to sit up without assistance, and even take a few tentative steps around the cabin. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the fever that had threatened to claim her life had finally broken completely. But Wade could see that she was troubled by something more than her physical injuries. She kept glancing toward the windows, with the wariness of a hunted animal, and her hand never strayed far from the knife Wade had given her for protection. "They're coming," she said quietly, joining him at the window. "I can feel it." Wade didn't dismiss her intuition. He had learned long ago that survival often depended on trusting instincts that couldn't be easily explained. Apache warriors were trained from childhood to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, to sense disturbances in the natural order that might indicate approaching danger. If Ayana felt that Morrison's men were closing in, Wade was inclined to believe her. "How long do you think we have?" he asked. Ayana closed her eyes, tilting her head slightly as if listening to sounds only she could hear. "Hours, not days. The storm has passed, and the snow will show our tracks clearly now. If they have a good tracker." She didn't need to finish the thought. Wade's cabin wasn't exactly hidden. Smoke from his chimney could be seen for miles on a clear day, and the path he had worn between his home and the nearby creek would be obvious to anyone with tracking experience. If Morrison's men were methodically searching the area, it was only a matter of time before they found him. Wade made a decision that surprised even himself. "We're leaving," he said, "as soon as you're strong enough to travel." Ayana stared at him in amazement. "This is your home. Why would you abandon it for me?" Wade was quiet for a long moment, struggling to put his feelings into words. The cabin represented 4 years of self-imposed exile, 4 years of trying to escape the pain of his losses by avoiding all human connection. But Ayana's presence had shown him that isolation wasn't healing, it was just a different kind of death. A home ain't just a building, Wade said finally. It's the people you share it with. And right now, you're the only person I got worth sharing anything with. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made them both uncomfortable. Wade had revealed more of his heart in those few words than he had to anyone since his family's death. And Ayana seemed to understand the magnitude of that revelation. Where would we go? She asked softly. Wade had been thinking about that question all morning. Their options were limited. Morrison's men would be watching the main roads, and the territorial authorities might not be trustworthy if the conspiracy Ayana had described reached as high as she suspected. But Wade had spent 2 years tracking his enemies through some of the most remote country in the territories, and he knew places where a man could disappear completely if he had the skills and determination. There's an old trading post about 50 miles north of here, Wade said. Been abandoned since the Crow Wars, but the buildings are still solid. We could hole up there until you're fully healed, then figure out our next move. Ayana nodded slowly, but Wade could see the doubt in her eyes. 50 miles through winter wilderness was a brutal journey for someone in perfect health. For someone recovering from gunshot wounds and torture, it might be impossible. I won't slow you down, she said with a fierce pride that reminded Wade why Apache warriors were so feared throughout the territories. I would rather die fighting than cowering in a corner. Wade smiled at her defiance, recognizing something of his own stubborn nature reflected in her words. Nobody's talking about cowering, he said. But we're going to be smart about this. No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures. We survive first, worry about pride later. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for the journey. Wade packed only the essential supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, enough food for a week, and the warmest clothes they could carry. Everything else would have to be left behind, including most of the possessions that connected him to his old life. As Wade loaded his saddlebags, he found himself holding a small daguerreotype of Catherine and Emma, the only photograph he had of his murdered family. For 4 years that image had been both his anchor and his torment, the reminder of everything he had lost and everything he was fighting to avenge. Now, looking at their faces, Wade felt something shift inside him. The pain was still there, but it was no longer the defining force of his existence. He carefully wrapped the photograph in oiled cloth and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The past would travel with him, but it would no longer control him. Ayana watched these preparations with growing agitation, her warrior's instincts clearly telling her that time was running out. She had found clothing in Wade's belongings that would fit her, a spare shirt and trousers that she had altered with her knife to accommodate her smaller frame. Over these, she wore a heavy coat that had belonged to Wade's wife, a garment that carried the faint scent of lavender and happier times. We should go now, Ayana said as Wade finished securing the last of their supplies. Every moment we delay gives them more time to surround us. Wade nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. He had been reluctant to leave the cabin, but staying would only put them both at greater risk. As he saddled Ranger and prepared the spare horse he used for pack trips, Wade tried not to think about the fact that he might never see his home again. They were just preparing to mount up when Ayana suddenly grabbed Wade's arm, her eyes wide with alarm. Listen, she whispered. Wade froze, straining his ears for whatever had caught her attention. At first, he heard nothing but the usual sounds of the wilderness wind through the pines, the distant call of a hawk, the soft whisper of snow settling on branches. Then, faintly he caught it, the rhythmic crunch of horses moving through deep snow, still distant, but definitely approaching. How many? Wade asked, his voice barely audible. Ayana closed her eyes. concentrating with the intensity of someone whose life depended on accurate assessment. 6 riders, she said after a moment, maybe 7. Moving carefully, but not trying to be completely silent. They expect to find you alone. Wade felt the familiar cold calm that had served him well during his years of violence. 7 men were manageable odds if he chose his position well and didn't allow them to coordinate their attack. But with Ayanna to protect, the tactical situation became infinitely more complex. The old mine shaft, Wade said, referring to a played-out gold claim about a quarter mile from his cabin. We can reach it without being seen if we go through the ravine. Ayanna shook her head. They'll find our tracks. Better to make our stand here, where you know the ground. Wade considered her words, weighing the advantages of familiar terrain against the dangers of being trapped in a fixed position. The cabin was defensible, but it was also a potential death trap if they were surrounded. On the other hand, running through the wilderness with Morrison's men in pursuit would be almost equally dangerous. The decision was made for them when Wade spotted movement through the trees, a flash of blue that could only be cavalry uniforms, moving in a loose line toward the cabin. Morrison's men had found them, and they were approaching with the confidence of predators who believed their prey was cornered. Inside, Wade said urgently, helping Ayanna dismount. We'll have to fight our way out. But even as they rushed toward the cabin door, Wade knew that their situation was desperate. 7 armed men against 1 wounded woman and a single defender were not odds that any reasonable person would accept. They would need luck, skill, and perhaps a miracle to survive the next hour. Inside the cabin, Wade quickly positioned himself at the front window while Ayanna took up a position at the side window where she could watch the flanking approaches. Wade had given her one of his revolvers, and despite her injuries, she handled the weapon with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Remember, Wade said as the sound of approaching horses grew louder, we're not trying to win a war. We just need to create enough chaos to break free and reach the horses. Ayanna nodded, her face set in lines of grim determination. I understand. But Wade, if something happens to me, don't let them take me alive. Promise me that. Wade looked into her eyes and saw the steel of someone who had already endured unspeakable torment and would not endure it again. That won't be necessary, he said firmly. We're both getting out of this. The riders came into view a few minutes later, spreading out in a rough semicircle around the cabin's front. Wade recognized the leader immediately. Sergeant Caleb Morrison was exactly as Ayanna had described him, a tall man with a white mustache and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. But there was something corrupt about him, a casual cruelty that showed in the way he sat his horse and surveyed Wade's home like a conqueror examining his spoils. Morrison raised his hand, and his men halted just outside rifle range. The sergeant himself rode forward a few more paces, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Wade Cordell, Morrison called out. I know you're in there, and I know you've got something that belongs to me. Send out the Apache girl, and maybe we can work out an arrangement that keeps you breathing. Wade remained silent, studying the positions of Morrison's men and looking for weaknesses in their formation. 2 of them had dismounted and were moving to flank the cabin, while the others remained mounted in case a pursuit became necessary. They were experienced fighters, but they were also overconfident. They expected this to be easy. I'm not an unreasonable man, Cordell, Morrison continued when Wade didn't respond. I know the girls probably told you some sob story about being mistreated, but you don't understand the bigger picture here. She's got information that could get a lot of good men killed if it falls into the wrong hands. The only thing I understand, Wade called back, is that you're trespassing on my land. You've got 10 seconds to get off it before I start shooting. Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. You always were a hard case, Cordell. I heard about what you did to those Comanche after they killed your family. Impressive work, even if it was a bit excessive. but you're outnumbered here, and I've got men positioned to burn you out if necessary." Wade felt Ayanna tense beside him, and he knew she was thinking about the same thing Morrison had done his homework. He knew about Wade's reputation, knew about his family, probably knew about his 2-year quest for vengeance. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned operation. "Last chance, Cordell," Morrison said, his voice losing its false reasonableness. "Send out the girl, or we'll come in and get her. Either way, she's leaving with us." Wade exchanged a glance with Ayanna, seeing his own determination reflected in her dark eyes. They both knew that surrender meant death for her, and probably for him as well. Morrison couldn't afford to leave witnesses alive, not with the conspiracy Ayanna had uncovered. "Well," Wade said quietly, checking his rifle one final time, "I reckon that settles it." The first shot came from Morrison himself, a rifle bullet that splintered the window frame inches from Wade's head. Wade's return shot was immediate and deadly accurate, taking one of the flanking men out of the saddle before he could reach cover. Battle for Wade's cabin had begun, and with it, the events that would transform a simple act of mercy into a legend that would be told around frontier campfires for generations to come. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Wade's second shot dropped another of Morrison's men before the soldier could find adequate cover behind a pine tree. But the remaining attackers were seasoned fighters who recovered quickly from the initial shock, spreading out to create multiple angles of attack that would make Wade's defensive position untenable. Ayanna proved herself to be far more than just a burden in the fight. From her position at the side window, she managed to wound one of the flanking attackers with a pistol shot that demonstrated remarkable accuracy despite her injuries. The man screamed and fell back, clutching his shoulder, but continued to fire from behind the fallen log. "They're trying to pin us down while the others circle behind," Ayanna called out, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Morrison's no fool, he's fought Indians before." Wade could see the truth of her assessment. The frontal assault was designed to keep them focused on the main threat, while other members of Morrison's team moved to positions where they could attack the cabin from multiple directions. It was sound military tactics, the kind of coordinated assault that had served the U.S. Army well in dozens of Indian wars. But Wade had learned a few things during his own years of warfare, and he wasn't about to let Morrison dictate the terms of engagement. Grabbing his shotgun from where it leaned against the wall, Wade moved to the back window and waited patiently for the flanking maneuver he knew was coming. Sure enough, 2 of Morrison's men appeared at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, moving with the careful precision of soldiers who knew their business. They were good, but they weren't expecting Wade to be watching for them. His first shotgun blast caught the lead man's center mass, the heavy buckshot lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the snow. The second man dove for cover, but not before Wade got a good look at his face. It was a young soldier, barely out of his teens, with the kind of soft features that suggested he had never seen real combat before joining Morrison's band of outlaws. Wade felt a brief pang of regret. The boy was probably following orders rather than acting from personal malice, but he pushed the emotion aside. In situations like this, hesitation meant death. Morrison's voice cut through the gunfire, bellowing orders to his remaining men. "Johnson, keep them pinned. Stevens, get around to the left side. We need to end this quickly before someone hears the shooting." Wade realized that Morrison was worried about attracting attention from other settlers, or perhaps a military patrol. Crow's Hollow was only 2 miles away, and sustained gunfire would certainly be investigated. The sergeant was operating on a timetable, which might give Wade and Ayanna the advantage if they could hold out long enough, but holding out was proving more difficult than Wade had anticipated. Morrison's men had found good cover positions and were maintaining a steady rate of fire that made it dangerous to show themselves at any window. Worse, Wade could see smoke beginning to rise from the roof, Someone had managed to get close enough to the cabin to start a fire. "They're burning us out," Ayanna said, coughing as the first wisps of smoke began to filter down through the ceiling. "We need to move now before the whole place goes up." Wade nodded grimly. The cabin that had been his refuge for 4 years was about to become his tomb unless they could break free from Morrison's trap. But escaping would require them to expose themselves to concentrated fire from multiple directions, a prospect that would have been suicidal even for an uninjured person. "The root cellar," Wade said suddenly, remembering the small underground storage space he had dug beneath the cabin's floor. "There's a tunnel that leads to the old well. We can get out that way." Ayanna's eyes lit up with understanding. The tunnel would put them beyond the immediate perimeter Morrison had established, giving them a chance to reach the horses and escape into the wilderness. It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting to be burned alive, Wade pried. Up the floorboards that concealed the entrance to the root cellar, revealing a narrow opening that dropped into darkness. The space below was cramped and cold, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it represented their only hope of survival. "You first," Wade said, helping Ayanna lower herself into the opening. "The tunnel branches about 20 feet. Intake the left fork and keep crawling until you reach the well shaft." Ayanna squeezed his hand briefly before disappearing into the darkness. "Don't be long," she whispered. "I won't leave without you." Wade took one last look around the cabin that had been his home, his sanctuary, his prison. The smoke was getting thicker now, and he could hear the crackle of flames beginning to spread across the roof. Everything he owned, everything that connected him to his past, was about to be consumed by fire. But as he lowered himself into the root cellar, Wade realized that he wasn't losing his home, he was gaining something far more valuable. For the first time in 4 years, he had someone to live for, someone whose survival mattered more than his own desire for vengeance or solitude. The tunnel was even more cramped than Wade remembered, forcing him to crawl on hands and knees through the narrow passage he had carved out of the frozen earth. The sound of gunfire was muffled now, but he could still hear Morrison's men shouting to each other as they discovered that their quarry had escaped the burning cabin. Wade found Ayanna waiting for him at the base of the old well shaft, her face pale but determined. Above them, the wooden cover of the well was partially rotted away, creating an opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. Wade boosted Ayanna up first, then hauled himself out of the shaft with muscles that protested. Every movement, they emerged into a small grove of aspens about 50 yards from the cabin, which was now fully engulfed in flames. Morrison's men were so focused on the fire that they didn't immediately notice the 2 figures moving through the trees toward the lean-to where Wade had sheltered his horses, but their luck couldn't last forever. As Wade and Ayanna reached the horses, one of Morrison's men spotted them and raised the alarm. Suddenly, the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the whistle of bullets cutting through the branches overhead. Wade threw Ayanna onto the back of the pack horse, then vaulted onto Ranger's back with an agility that surprised him. He hadn't realized how much Ayanna's presence had energized him, how her trust and courage had awakened reflexes he thought he had lost. "Hold on," Wade shouted, spurring Ranger into a gallop that sent snow flying in all directions. Behind them, Morrison's surviving men were scrambling to reach their own horses, but Wade had gained a crucial head start. The chase that followed was unlike anything Wade had experienced during his years of frontier warfare. Morrison's men were expert riders who knew how to maintain pursuit over difficult terrain, but Wade had the advantage of knowing every game trail, every creek bed, every rocky outcrop in the surrounding wilderness. For the first hour, Wade concentrated on putting distance between them and their pursuers, pushing the horses to their limits over terrain that would have challenged even experienced mountain men. Ayanna clung to her horse's back with grim determination, her face set in lines of pain but her spirit unbroken as they climbed higher into the mountains. The snow became deeper and the air thinner. Wade could feel Ranger beginning to labor beneath him, and the pack horse carrying Ayanna was showing signs of exhaustion. They would need to rest soon. But Morrison's men showed no signs of giving up the pursuit. It was Ayanna who suggested the solution. "The sacred canyon," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "2 miles north, my people consider it cursed. Morrison's men won't follow us there." Wade knew the place she meant, a narrow gorge carved by centuries of spring runoff, filled with strange rock formations that seemed to defy natural explanation. The local tribes avoided it, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of warriors who had died in ancient battles. Wade didn't believe in curses, but he did believe in superstition. If Morrison's men shared the local tribe's fear of the canyon, it might provide the sanctuary they desperately needed. The entrance to the canyon was so narrow that Wade almost missed it, a gap between 2 towering cliffs that seemed to lead nowhere. But as they guided their exhausted horses through the opening, Wade realized that Ayanna had led them to something extraordinary. The canyon opened into a hidden valley, warmed by natural hot springs and sheltered from the worst of the mountain weather. Ancient pictographs covered the canyon walls, telling stories of hunts and battles that had taken place centuries before white men ever set foot in the Dakota territory. But most remarkably, the valley wasn't empty. A small band of Apache warriors had made camp near the largest of the hot springs, their horses grazing peacefully in the lush grass that somehow grew green even in the depths of winter. Wade's hand moved instinctively to his revolver, but Ayanna placed a gentle hand on his arm. "They are my people," she said softly. "My father's warriors searching for me." The leader of the Apache band was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Wade recognized the family resemblance immediately. This had to be Chief Nalnish, Ayanna's father, the war leader who had been trying to negotiate peace with the territorial government. The reunion between father and daughter was touching in its intensity. Nalnish embraced Ayanna with tears streaming down his weathered face, speaking rapidly in Apache while his warriors gathered around them in a protective circle. But Wade could see that the chief's joy was tempered by rage as he examined his daughter's injuries and heard her account of Morrison's brutality. When Ayanna gestured toward Wade and explained how he had saved her life, Nalnish's expression became unreadable. The chief approached Wade slowly, his hand resting on the handle of his war tomahawk. For a moment, Wade thought he might be about today killed by the very people he had helped, in a canyon that few white men had ever seen. But instead of violence, Nalnish extended his hand in a gesture of respect that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You saved my daughter's life," the chief said simply. "This makes you brother to the Apache, for as long as you draw breath." Wade felt something shift inside him as he grasped the chief's hand. The hatred and suspicion that had poisoned his relationships with the local tribes began to dissolve, replaced by something he hadn't expected, the possibility of friendship across the divide of war and prejudice. But their reunion was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the canyon entrance. Morrison and his remaining men had tracked them to the sacred valley, and they were preparing for a final assault that would settle the matter once and for all. As Wade, Ayanna, and Chief Nalnish prepared to face their common enemy together, none of them could have imagined that the events of the next few hours would become the stuff of legend, a story that would be told and retold, until fact and fiction became indistinguishable, until the simple act of one man helping another became a tale of heroism that would inspire generations of frontier settlers. The sound of Morrison's approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, amplified and distorted by the strange acoustics of the ancient valley. Chief Nalnish barked orders in Apache to his warriors, who immediately began taking defensive positions among the rocks and natural formations that dotted the canyon floor. These were seasoned fighters who had survived countless battles with both rival tribes and white soldiers, and their movements showed the fluid precision of men who trusted each other completely. Wade found himself caught between two worlds as he watched the Apache warriors prepare for battle. Part of him remained the white settler who had spent years viewing these men as mortal enemies, while another part recognized them as skilled allies who might be his only hope for survival. The contradiction was unsettling, forcing him to confront prejudices he hadn't even realized he carried. "Morrison has 4 men left," Ayanna said, appearing at Wade's side with a Winchester rifle she had taken from her father's supplies. Despite her injuries, she moved with the deadly grace of a born warrior, and Wade could see why the Apache trained their women in the arts of war. "But they are desperate now, which makes them more dangerous than when they outnumbered us." Wade nodded, understanding the tactical situation all too well. Desperate men fought without regard for their own safety, taking risks that rational soldiers would avoid. Morrison's remaining force might be smaller, but they would be fighting with the fury of cornered animals. Chief Nalnish approached them, his weathered face grim with determination. "My daughter tells me this Morrison has powerful friends in the territorial government," he said in his careful English. "Men who profit from war between our peoples. If we kill him here, in the sacred place, his death will carry great weight with both our tribes." Wade felt a chill as he understood what the chief was suggesting. The battle about to unfold wasn't just about rescuing Ayanna or stopping Morrison's band of outlaws. It was about striking a blow against the corruption that had poisoned relations between whites and Indians throughout the territories. The sacred canyon would witness more than just a fight. It would see the birth of something that could change the entire balance of power in the region. The first of Morrison's men appeared at the canyon entrance, his horse picking its way carefully through the narrow opening between the towering cliffs. Wade could see the soldier's nervousness as he took in the ancient pictographs and strange rock formations that gave the canyon its fearsome reputation among the local tribes. Superstition warred with duty in the man's face, but Morrison's iron discipline won out, and he continued forward. Morrison himself rode through the gap moments later, his cavalry saber drawn and gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Even from a distance, Wade could see the rage that twisted the sergeant's features as he spotted Ayanna standing beside her father and the white man who had thwarted his plans, Chief Nalnish. Morrison's voice boomed across the valley, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Sergeant Caleb Morrison, United States Army. You're harboring fugitives from military justice, and I demand their immediate surrender." Chief Nalnish stepped forward with the dignity of a man who had never bowed to any authority but his own conscience. "I know who you are, Morrison," he replied, his voice carrying clearly despite the canyon's strange acoustics. "You are the one who murdered my peace delegation. You are the one who tortured my daughter. You have no authority here except what you try to claim through violence." Morrison's face darkened at the chief's words, but Wade could see calculation behind the anger. The sergeant was outnumbered nearly 2-1, trapped in unfamiliar terrain, and facing opponents who knew every rock and crevice of the canyon. A smart man would have retreated and waited for reinforcements, but Morrison's arrogance and desperation drove him forward. "Your daughter is a thief and a spy," Morrison shouted back. "She stole classified military documents that could endanger American lives. I don't care if I have to burn this whole canyon to get her back." The lie was so brazen that Wade almost laughed despite the deadly seriousness of the situation. Morrison was trying to justify his actions by portraying Ayanna as a military threat, when everyone present knew she had been tortured simply because she had witnessed his crimes. But Chief Nalnish wasn't interested in Morrison's justifications. The old war leader raised his hand, and his warriors tensed like bowstrings drawn to their full extent. "You have dishonored yourself and your uniform," the chief declared. "You have brought violence to a sacred place, the spirits of this canyon. Demand justice, and we will give it to them." Morrison's response was to spur his horse forward, his saber raised in a classic cavalry charge that would have been devastating on an open battlefield. But the canyon floor was littered with boulders and natural obstacles that broke up his momentum, and the Apache warriors were ready for him. The battle erupted with shocking suddenness. Wade's first shot took Morrison's lead rider out of the saddle before the man could bring his rifle to bear, while arrows from the Apache warriors found their marks with deadly precision. Morrison himself managed to reach the first line of defenders, his saber flashing as he tried to cut his way through to where Ayanna stood. But Chief Nalnish was there to meet him, the old warrior moving with a speed and grace that belied his years. The clash between cavalry saber and Apache war club sent sparks flying, and Wade realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Single combat between leaders that would determine the fate of everyone in the canyon. While the chiefs fought their personal duel, Wade found himself engaged in a running battle with Morrison's remaining men. These were experienced soldiers who had survived the crucible of the Civil War and the Indian conflicts that followed, and they fought with the desperate skill of men who knew they were fighting for their lives. One of them, a scarred veteran, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, managed to work his way around to Wade's flank while Wade was focused on another target. The man's rifle shot missed Wade's head by inches, the bullet shattering the rock face behind him and sending stone fragments flying like shrapnel. Wade spun and returned fire, but his shot went wide as his foot slipped on the loose gravel that covered much of the canyon floor. The veteran soldier worked the lever of his repeating rifle with practiced efficiency, clearly intending to end the fight with his next shot. But Ayanna was there, appearing from behind a boulder like an avenging spirit. Her knife took the soldier in the back, sliding between his ribs with the precision of someone who had been taught anatomy along with warfare. The man's rifle clattered to the ground as he collapsed, his eyes wide with surprise that his life had been ended by someone he probably viewed as little more than a savage. "Behind you!" Ayanna shouted, and Wade spun to see another of Morrison's men taking aim from an elevated position among the rocks. Wade's return shot was instinctive, guided more by desperation than careful aim, but it found its mark. The soldier pitched forward and tumbled down the rocky slope, his body coming to rest in the crystal-clear waters of one of the canyon's hot springs. As the gunfire died away, Wade realized that only Chief Nalnish and Morrison remained locked in their deadly dance. The sergeant had lost his saber in the fierce combat, but he had drawn his service revolver and was trying to get close enough to use it effectively. Chief Nalnish's war club had been splintered by Morrison's blade, but the old warrior had produced a tomahawk that seemed to move like liquid lightning in his weathered hands. The two men circled each other warily, each looking for an opening that would end the fight. Morrison was younger and stronger, but Chief Nalnish had the advantage of fighting on ground that was sacred to his people, and Wade could see that the spiritual significance of the place was giving the old warrior strength beyond his physical years. Morrison made his final mistake when he tried to use Ayanna as a human shield, grabbing her arm and pressing his revolver to her temple. "Stand down, old man," he gasped, his breath coming in harsh pants from the exertion of the fight. "I'll kill her if you don't surrender right now." But Morrison had underestimated both the courage of the woman he held captive and the depths of her father's rage. Ayanna drove her elbow into Morrison's solar plexus with enough force to double him over, while Chief Nalnish's tomahawk described a perfect arc that ended at the base of the sergeant's skull. Morrison died instantly, his body crumpling to the canyon floor beside the ancient pictographs that had witnessed countless battles over the centuries. But his death was different from the others. It carried a weight of symbolism that went far beyond the simple elimination of a criminal. The corrupt sergeant had died in a place sacred to the Apache, killed by a chief whose daughter he had tortured, in the presence of a white man who had chosen honor over racial loyalty. As the echoes of the battle faded away, replaced by the peaceful sound of wind through the canyon, and the gentle bubbling of the hot springs. Wade realized that he had witnessed something that would be remembered long after all the participants were dead. The story of Morrison's defeat would spread through both white settlements and Indian camps, carrying with it a message that transcended the usual narratives of frontier violence. Chief Nalnish approached Morrison's body and performed a brief ritual, speaking words in Apache that Wade couldn't understand, but that clearly held deep significance. When the chief finished, he looked up at Wade with eyes that held both grief and hope. "It is finished," Nalnish said simply. "The spirits of this place are satisfied, and the debt of blood has been paid." But Wade knew that the chief was wrong. It wasn't finished at all. In fact, it was just beginning. The events in the sacred canyon would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting the lives of people who hadn't even been born yet. Ayanna moved to stand between her father and Wade, symbolically bridging the gap between two cultures that had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. "This is where it changes," she said softly, her words barely audible above the wind. "This is where we stop being enemies and start being something new." Wade felt the truth of her words settling into his bones like the deep ache of old wounds, finally beginning to heal. The man who had entered this canyon was not the same one who would leave it. The rage and hatred that had driven him for 4 years had been burned away in the crucible of battle and replaced by something he had never expected to feel again. Hope that, as the Apache warriors began the solemn task of preparing Morrison's men for burial, Wade realized that he was watching the birth of a legend. The story of the battle in Spirit Canyon would be told and retold, embellished and mythologized, until the simple facts became something larger than life. Future generations would speak of the day when a white hunter and an Apache princess stood together against corruption and won, when enemies became allies in the face of a common evil. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of violence, Wade was content to simply stand beside Ayanna and her father, watching the sun set over the sacred valley where his old life had died and his new one had been born. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but no longer hopeless, filled with possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine just a few days before. The legend of Wade Cordell and Morning Star was about to begin. Born in blood and baptized in the sacred waters of a hidden canyon that few white men would ever see. But the story they had started would echo through the territories for generations, a testament to the power of mercy, courage, and the bonds that could unite even the most unlikely allies. As darkness fell over the canyon, Wade realized that he was no longer the bitter, isolated man who had found a dying girl in his wagon shed just days before. That man had died in the flames of his burning cabin, and what emerged from the sacred canyon would be something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred. The legend was born, but the man behind it was just beginning to understand what that legend would demand of him in the years to come. 3 months after the battle in Spirit Canyon, Wade Cordell stood on the porch of a newly constructed trading post that straddled the border between Apache territory and the white settlements of the Dakota territory. The building itself was a marvel of cooperation, constructed using traditional Apache techniques for the framework and white man's methods for the walls and roof, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture while serving both. Morning sun cast long shadows across the valley below, where members of both communities moved freely among each other in ways that would have been unthinkable just a season earlier. Apache women sold intricate beadwork and pottery to white settlers, while frontier craftsmen traded metal tools and firearms to native customers who paid with furs, silver, and knowledge of the land that no white map could capture. Wade watched this peaceful commerce with a satisfaction that ran deeper than mere pride. The trading post had been Ayanna's idea, a neutral ground where both peoples could meet safely, conduct business, and slowly learn to see each other as something more than enemies. But turning that vision into reality had required months of careful negotiation, delicate diplomacy, and more than a few tense moments when old hatreds threatened to derail the entire project. The transformation hadn't been easy for anyone involved. Wade himself had struggled with the challenge of adapting to a world where his reputation as an Indian fighter was as much a liability as an asset. Many white settlers viewed his partnership with Chief Nalnish with suspicion, seeing it as either a betrayal of his own people or a clever scheme to gain some advantage over the Apache. Similarly, many Apache warriors found it difficult to trust a man who had spent years hunting their kind, regardless of how many lives he had saved or how many battles he had fought alongside them. But gradually, through countless small interactions and shared experiences, barriers began to erode. The first breakthrough had come when a group of white children, lost in a sudden blizzard, had been rescued by Apache hunters who brought them safely to the trading post instead of simply leaving them to die. The second had occurred when Apache warriors helped defend a settler family from a band of Sioux raiders, asking nothing in return except the acknowledgement that they were capable of mercy. Each incident built upon the last, creating a foundation of trust that grew stronger with time. Wade found himself serving as more than just a mediator. He became a translator not just of languages but of cultures, helping each side understand the motivations and customs of the other. Ayanna emerged from the trading post's main building, carrying a leather satchel filled with the correspondence that arrived weekly from territorial officials, military commanders, and tribal leaders throughout the region. Her recovery from Morrison's torture had been complete, but the experience had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical scars she would carry for the rest of her life. The innocent girl who had stumbled into Wade's wagon shed had become a formidable woman who commanded respect from both cultures. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you again," she said, handing him a letter bearing the official seal of the Dakota territory. "He's offering a formal position as Indian agent with full military support and a substantial salary." Wade read the letter with growing amusement. Governor Harrison had been making increasingly generous offers ever since word of the Spirit Canyon battle had reached the territorial capital. The official story, carefully crafted to avoid embarrassing the U.S. Army, portrayed Wade as a heroic civilian who had helped military forces eliminate a dangerous band of renegades. The truth that Morrison had been a corrupt sergeant leading Army deserters in criminal activities had been buried beneath layers of bureaucratic language and convenient omissions. "What did you tell him?" Wade asked, though he already knew the answer. "The same thing I told him last month, and the month before that," Ayanna replied with a smile that reminded Wade of why he had fallen in love with her. "That Wade Cordell makes his own decisions and doesn't need the territorial government's permission to do what's right." Their relationship had deepened over the months since the Canyon battle, evolving from mutual respect and shared trauma into something that transcended the racial barriers that divided their peoples. They had married in a ceremony that honored both Apache and Christian traditions, creating another small bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. The wedding itself had become the stuff of legend among both communities. Chief Nalnish had performed the Apache rituals, while Reverend Matthews from Crow's Hollow had conducted the Christian service. The guest list had included Apache war chiefs and white settlers, territorial officials and tribal elders, creating a gathering that many had thought impossible just months earlier. But perhaps more significant than the ceremony itself was what it represented: proof that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided human beings into categories of us and them. The marriage of Wade Cordell and Ayanna Nalnish had become a symbol of hope for those who dared to believe that the frontier could be something more than an endless cycle of violence and revenge. "Colonel Westbrook is coming for a visit next week," Ayanna continued, referring to the military commander who had replaced Morrison's corrupt superior. "He wants to discuss expanding the trading post concept to other regions." Wade nodded thoughtfully. Colonel Westbrook was one of the few military officers who had shown genuine interest in finding peaceful solutions to the territory's Indian problems. Unlike his predecessors who had viewed all Native Americans as obstacles to be removed or destroyed, Westbrook understood that successful expansion required cooperation rather than conquest. The colonel's support had been crucial in legitimizing Wade's efforts to establish peaceful relations between the communities. Military protection had enabled white settlers to visit Apache territory without fear, while Westbrook's promise to punish soldiers who violated treaty agreements had given the Apache confidence that their cooperation would be respected rather than exploited. "There's something else," Ayanna said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Runners from the Crow Nation brought word yesterday. They found evidence of another group like Morrison's army deserters working with corrupt officials to stir up trouble between tribes." Wade felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The success of the trading post had made him a target for those who profited from frontier violence, and he knew that Morrison's death had only temporarily disrupted the larger conspiracy that Ayanna had uncovered. There were still men in positions of power who viewed peace as a threat to their financial interests, and they would not hesitate to manufacture conflicts if natural ones were not available. "How many men?" Wade asked. "At least 20, possibly more. They're operating out of Fort Bridger, selling weapons to raiding parties, and then blaming the attacks on peaceful tribes. The pattern is identical to what Morrison was doing." Wade considered the implications. Fort Bridger was nearly 200 miles away, in territory that was technically outside his sphere of influence. But the cancer of corruption that had infected the territorial administration wouldn't stop spreading simply because he chose to ignore it. "We'll need help," Wade said finally. "This is bigger than what we can handle alone." Ayanna smiled, and Wade realized that she had been hoping he would reach that conclusion. "My father has already spoken with the other tribal leaders. They're willing to provide warriors if you're willing to lead them." The idea of commanding a mixed force of Apache, white settlers, and possibly regular army troops against a common enemy was both thrilling and terrifying. Wade had never aspired to leadership on such a scale, but he was beginning to understand that the legend that had grown up around him carried responsibilities as well as recognition. Over the following days, word spread throughout the territory that Wade Cordell was organizing an expedition to root out corruption wherever it might be found. Volunteers began arriving at the trading post, some seeking adventure, others motivated by genuine desire for justice, and a few driven by simple curiosity about the man who had supposedly tamed the frontier through the power of love and understanding. Among the volunteers was Captain James Mitchell, a young cavalry officer who had served under Colonel Westbrook and had grown disgusted with the Army's traditional approach to Indian relations. Mitchell brought with him a dozen hand-picked soldiers who were willing to follow orders that prioritized justice over military protocol. "I've read the reports about what happened in Spirit Canyon," Mitchell told Wade during their first meeting. "If even half of those stories are true, you've accomplished something that the entire U.S. Army hasn't been able to do in 50 years of trying." Wade was uncomfortable with the hero worship he detected in the young officer's voice, but he recognized that Mitchell's support would be crucial to the success of their mission. Regular Army backing would give their expedition legitimacy and make it harder for corrupt officials to dismiss their findings. The expedition that finally set out from the trading post was unlike anything the Dakota territory had ever seen. Apache warriors rode alongside cavalry troopers, while white settlers marched next to tribal elders who carried the sacred objects of their people. It was a living demonstration of what cooperation could accomplish when people chose to focus on shared goals rather than ancient grievances. Wade found himself at the head of this unlikely army, a position he had never sought, but which seemed to fit him better than he had expected. Ayanna rode beside him, serving as both translator and advisor, her presence a constant reminder of why they were fighting and what they hoped to achieve. The journey to Fort Bridger took 2 weeks, during which the expedition encountered numerous challenges that tested both their military effectiveness and their unity as a diverse force. They fought off attacks by hostile war parties, weathered fierce storms that threatened to scatter their ranks, and navigated political obstacles created by territorial officials who viewed their mission with suspicion. But with each challenge overcome, the bonds between the expedition members grew stronger. Apache warriors taught cavalry troopers how to read signs in the wilderness, while soldiers shared their knowledge of modern military tactics with tribal fighters. White settlers learned Apache methods of finding water in seemingly barren country, while Native Americans discovered the advantages of coordinated artillery fire. By the time they reached Fort Bridger, Wade commanded not just a military force, but a genuine community, a group of people who had learned to see past surface differences to the common humanity that united them all. It was, he realized, a microcosm of what the entire frontier could become if enough people were willing to make the effort. The confrontation at Fort Bridger was swift and decisive. The corrupt officials and army deserters, caught completely off guard by the size and diversity of Wade's force, offered only token resistance before surrendering. The evidence of their crimes was overwhelming: stolen weapons, forged documents, and testimonies from victims of their schemes painted a picture of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the territorial administration. But perhaps more important than the military victory was the symbolic impact of Wade's expedition. News of the mixed forces' success spread rapidly throughout the territories, carrying with it a message that challenged every assumption about the inevitability of racial conflict on the frontier. Tribal leaders, who had spent decades fighting white expansion, began to consider the possibility of negotiated settlements. Military commanders who had viewed all Indians as implacable enemies started to explore alternatives to total war. Settlers who had lived in constant fear of attack began to imagine communities where their children could grow up alongside native children in peace. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Generations of hatred and mistrust couldn't be erased overnight. But Wade's example had shown that change was possible, that individual choices could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. As Wade and Ayanna stood together on a hill overlooking Fort Bridger, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, they both understood that their story was far from over. The legend that had begun with a simple act of mercy in a wagon shed would continue to grow and evolve, inspiring others to make their own choices. Between hatred and understanding, between vengeance and forgiveness. What happens now? Ayanna asked, her hand finding his as they watched their mixed force break camp below. Wade considered the question seriously. They could return to their trading post and resume their quiet work of building bridges between communities. They could accept the territorial governor's offers and work within the existing system to promote change. Or they could continue traveling, carrying their message of cooperation to other regions where ancient conflicts still raged. Now we go home, Wade said finally. And we build something that will outlast us both. The journey back to their trading post was triumphant, marked by celebrations in both white settlements and native camps as word of their victory preceded them. But for Wade, the real satisfaction came not from the accolades or the recognition, but from the knowledge that they had proven something important, that the cycle of violence that had defined the frontier for so long was not inevitable, that people could choose a different path if they had the courage to walk it. Years later, when storytellers gathered around campfires to share tales of the Old West, they would speak of Wade Cordell and Morning Star as figures of legend, the white hunter and the Apache princess who had tamed the savage frontier through the power of love. The stories would grow in the telling, embellished with supernatural elements and impossible feats of heroism. But those who had known Wade and Ayanna personally would remember something different, not superhuman legends, but ordinary people who had made extraordinary choices. They would remember a man who had chosen mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. They would remember a woman who had survived unimaginable cruelty and emerged not broken, but stronger, dedicated to ensuring that others would never have to endure what she had experienced. And they would remember that the most powerful force on the frontier had not been gunpowder or cavalry sabers or military tactics, but the simple recognition that all human beings, regardless of race or culture or history, shared the same fundamental needs for dignity, respect, and the chance to build something better for their children. The legend of Wade Cordell and Mourning Star would endure long after the frontier itself had become history, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, individual acts of courage and compassion could light the world a better future.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.